It's a question I've been asked more than a few times in the past couple of years, and I'm going to answer it today. Simply put, why Augie Franco-Belgian comics? The answer is coming up today on the Pipeline Comics Podcast. Hi, I'm Augie DeBleek Jr., and welcome back to the Pipeline Comics Podcast, taking a North American look at European comics and a whole lot more. If you normally read PipelineComics.com website, you already have an idea of the kind of mix of topics we'll be discussing on this podcast. But today, I want to start at the beginning and answer that question I mentioned before. Why European comics? Why Franco-Belgian comics, or Les Bandes Dessinées, or BD as they're called for short sometimes? And there's a number of reasons for it. One is I am predisposed to it. I grew up on the Smurfs. I think anyone around my age probably did. In the 80s, you couldn't avoid them. Saturday morning was anchored on that Smurfs block of time. Everything else came around them, and I had a whole bunch of the Smurfs figurines and all that kind of stuff growing up too. Second, I do have some Belgian heritage. On my father's side of the family, they came over 120, 130 years ago, however long it was. I do actually have the Ellis Island log that shows where they came over and through the island. Those are kind of minor reasons. There are bigger reasons, and we'll discuss those as we go. I don't know what my first European comic was necessarily. I'm sure I read one of them in the 90s. My local comic shop, Dewey's Comic City in Madison, New Jersey, still going strong. Used to have a bookshelf in the back where they had all sorts of odd-sized trade paperbacks and hardcovers and stuff, and they did have a smattering of books that had been printed over the years there. I remember seeing some old Lucky Luke and even some Asterix books there. And I know I picked up one or two somewhere along the line, although I'm not sure of the timeline exactly. But I do know where it began in earnest, and that was at the San Diego Comic-Con in the early 2000s. I'm not sure which year it was exactly, but I remember being on the hall's floor, and there were fewer halls back then. When I started going in 1999, it was like halls A and B, and then it expanded it to A, B, C, D, and who thought it could get bigger than that? And now it's A through H, of course. But when I was writing for Comic Book Resources at the time, I'd always be scouting for something new to talk about, something for the Pipeline commentary and review column I wrote there every week. And I found some European comics that I thought looked interesting. They stood out in a big way, mostly because they were still being printed in the album format. Whether hardcover or softcover, they were bigger books. They're like twice the size of a standard-sized comic. They were, 50 pages long. They looked beautiful. Some of the stories were a little weird, but they looked great, and I started picking them up at places. Different publishers had them at the time. Fantagraphics had a few. Heavy Metal, which of course is Humanoids, had their own table. NBM was still translating a lot of stuff. They do to this day, but I think they did a little bit more back in the early 2000s. And of course, once you get involved with this kind of stuff, you can't miss Stuart Eng's booth. And if you've ever been to stuartengbooks.com, or is it stuarteng.com? I'll have to look that up later. Check out the show notes for more details at thepipelinepodcast.com. He imports the books from France. So these are not the translated ones that the publishers I just mentioned had, but these were the actual authentic, straight off the boat. Literally, in his case, he brought them over in a boat. French books and albums, and I picked up a few of those along the way. Didn't pick up too many, mostly because I couldn't read them, so I knew it was kind of counterproductive, but I picked up a few here and there, and they were awesome. So fast forward to 3 years ago. I'm writing PipelineComics.com, and I'm going back and rereading some of my old European comics, and I made a sort of a big discovery, really, and that is that European comics are now being translated at a really fast rate. If you take a look at European Comics, or Europe Comics is the name of the quote-unquote publisher, but they put out, like 20 new books, 15 new books a month. And there are now hundreds, if not thousands, of those translated editions available digitally. Digital comics is what's brought European comics, I believe, to America in a very big way. And I think it's part of the reason why it's a niche of comics that's bound to expand as we go. And why am I looking at those? Because mostly I've been reading comics for 30 years now. I've been writing about them for over 20. And I've been through the circles with Marvel and DC. I've been through all the cycles, really. I just don't find them appealing that much anymore. I still like superheroes. I still like a good superhero comic, but most of what Marvel and DC do these days is the reboots, all the new number ones, always an event. Never a complete story. You have to wait 5 months for one to finish up. The collected editions were kind of made up as they went along. They've gotten better about this, but there was a time there where they weren't sure if they wanted 6-issue collections, 12-issue collections, trade paperbacks, hardcovers, epic editions, omnibus, whatever you want. Now they seem to have sort of straightened that out to a certain degree, but you still find some really odd things. And my favorite example of this was when the Captain Marvel movie came out earlier this year, and Comixology had a big sale on Captain Marvel graphic novels that you could read, which were just trade paperbacks. And there were like 6 number 1 editions, 6 first volumes. Which one are you supposed to read? There are so many of them. It's just confusing. It's a mess. It's not the linear thing it used to be anymore. It's not for me. And that's fine. Let the next generation take it. I'm fine with that. I started reading more of the digital European comics, and I don't have any regrets about that. There are so many of them to read, and then there's, of course, they have 50, 60, 70 years of back matter they could translate also. And there's still new stuff coming out at almost an alarming rate in France. I'll tell you, there's probably too many. There's a lot of great stuff. I mean, the barn doors have been blown open, and I can't wait to read more and more of this stuff. Why? Well, the presentation is great. These are books that were created and expected to be printed on larger size paper. So you have, the album format, which is a little bit bigger, I think, most of the times than what you'd find in your sort of oversized omnibus editions or the oversized books that you get occasionally from Marvel and DC. But that extra paper size allows the art to really breathe and allows also the artists, if they wish, to put more story and more art on each given page. And you get some amazing artists over there that a lot of people over here haven't even heard of yet. Names like Francois Skyton, for example. The guy is an architect who draws comics, and the stuff he draws is utterly amazing. Now, I grant you some of those stories are a little far out there, even for me, but those are books I'd happily read just for the art. And then you also have people like Jose Luis Munuera, who has a very cartoony style that you don't see much over here. We had this invasion of animators in North American comics about 15, 20 years ago. And we seem to be having another group of them come through now, but I think animators do great comics because they know how to tell a story. They know how to make their characters live and breathe and act in ways that a lot of comic book artists who come up through comics and copying comics don't quite understand. So there's a lot of really beautiful art in there. The format, like I mentioned before, you get those larger album-sized books, but you also get complete stories. Most of these books are 48 pages, and it's a complete story, and you're done. Now, they do have some ongoing sagas. They do have some books that the stories are 2-parters or 3-parters. And even then, though, each book, as Heidi MacDonald would call it, is a satisfying chunk. When you read it, you get enough out of it that you're excited about reading the next one, and you feel like you've read enough on this one. And, of course, there's lots of humor books. We don't get too much humor books here in North America from the mainstream publishers, or at least the mainstream direct market publishers. And so that's a lot of fun to see, too. There are no superheroes in Europe. There are a couple. There's a couple parodies. Invincible, no relation to the Robert Kirkman character, is an amazing one if you want to talk about using the form, because the hero, the Invincible character there, or Imbitable, as I believe it's pronounced in France. I'm sorry, my French accent, as you'll learn throughout this podcast, is awful. His superpower is to break through panels and time. It's bizarre. You have to see it. There's a review up at pipelinecomics.com, of course. Take a look for it there. But they don't really do superheroes. They do everything else. They do the pirate books. They do the humor books. They do the romance books, the slice of life books, action, adventure, economic thrillers. I mean, whatever you can think of, whatever crazy idea you may have, there is most likely an album for that already being published out of Paris somewhere. And finally, the price point. Now, with print books, they're obviously going to be more. First of all, they're 48 pages instead of a 22-page comic. And with the larger page size, and if it's a hardcover especially, whether it's printed in France or printed in North America, it's going to be more expensive. But I will argue for that another day, that it's still a great value. But I can tell you this, if you're looking at just numbers, go to Comixology today, click on the sales tab, and scroll down and find the European comics that are on sale. You can find books that cost less than a single issue of a comic in print, on sale digitally through Comixology from Paris, that will give you 50 glorious pages of story that will take you 6 times longer to read, that will give you more of a story, and will be more entertaining, I would argue, than most of what's published here in many cases. Most in many cases. Yes, I just said that. I'm not taking it back. I'm moving on. I'm new to this podcast thing, remember? It's been 10 years. I've done it before. I'm not new. You get the idea. In the end, they are just comics. The Franco-Belgian comics are just bigger and better, I think, or at least they're different. And I needed something different. After 30 years of reading comics, I was looking for a change, and this is the one I found, and I want to drag a lot of you in with me. I'm not telling you to give up Marvel and DC, Image, Dark Horse, any of those books at all. I still read some of those, and I just pick and choose more carefully. I spend more of my time on these books because there's so many of them, like I said, and I want to read them all, and there's just not enough time. So, if that sounds interesting to you, please stick around. I'll have a lot more coming up. This podcast will update every Tuesday and Friday. Most episodes will probably be a little bit shorter than this. We're going to talk a lot about Franco-Belgian comics. I'm going to do a lot of reviews of them, some of the backstory, some of the history, some of the creators, some of the series, that kind of thing. And along the way, I'm still going to mix up. I have a lot of ideas for stuff going on right here in the North American market that I have things I'd like to say about, but don't really merit writing a whole article on pipelinecomics.com. So we'll be using that here as well. Check out my Patreon at patreon.com/pipelinecomics. If we get to a high enough figure there, I will, of course, do more of these podcasts because I like to do them. So thank you all for listening today. My name again, Augie Bleak Jr. Check out the show notes at thepipelinepodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.